It's April 29th, 2019. Our first interview was with F. Robert Cook, retired Nuclear Regulatory Commission overseer at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. First, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, like where you grew up and something about your early education.
Born in 1939 in St. Louis City. We lived in the St. Louis County at that stage. My parents did, and my brother and I. And then I went to school in Normandy, which is a county school district in St. Louis County. Grade school and then high school, Normandy High School, which had, when I was a freshman, when my brother graduated, had 2 presidential scholars in that school, out of 50 in the country. Okay, very good school. He went on to Washington University on a Westinghouse Science Fair project, and he was 5 years ahead, and he was in chemistry. He was a chemist, and got his PhD in chemistry, and I was sort of following in footsteps per my mother's insistence, and was in physics. And I also got a Westinghouse 4-year scholarship to Washington University in physics, or in whatever, okay? It turned out to be physics. And so I got my degree in 1961, it was an AB degree, and not a BS, but an AB, Bachelor of Arts, and then went, didn't know exactly what I was wanting to do, but I had some pretty good classes in high energy physics and electricity and magnetism that I liked. And so I applied to several colleges for fellowships for PhD. I got accepted at Rochester in the high energy physics group there with a stipend, free tuition, and a stipend of $175 a month or something like that. But Washington University also offered me a fellowship in the newly formed molecular biology group, which meant I didn't have to go away. I could live at home like I had been, and it had a $200 a month stipend. So I decided to go into molecular biology, which had my interest. It was a brand new program formed by Barry Commoner. I don't know if you know Barry. He was up at the University of Chicago originally and formed the first molecular biology program up there, and then came to Washington University and formed one down in St. Louis. And it was very intriguing. And so I did that in graduate school, took a lot of biology courses. The first year was basically comparative anatomy, embryology, cytology, and all the courses you take in normal biology. And then I was assigned a PhD thesis subject, which was to come up with a model and understanding of nerve physiology, how nerve impulses happen like they do. And I did research in that area for a while, and it didn't interest me, okay? I really couldn't get into it for whatever reason. And then this was during the Vietnamese War, 1962, I decided I better go into the Navy than get drafted into the Army, okay? And I did in middle of September 1962, enlisted in the Navy for officer candidate school. Went to officer candidate school for 4 months, and which is basic training. Came out with a officer's commission, ensign, and was assigned after an interview with H.G. Rickover in February, was assigned to the Naval Reactors program to work in the headquarters in Washington, D.C. In that program. And
That was Admiral Rickover, is that correct?
Yeah, Admiral Rickover's program. And there were probably about 200 engineers in naval reactors at that stage. And I went in and was accepted with another friend that in my same company in OCS, Officer Candidate School. We were both accepted. And so there I was. The scenario, this is right before the Poor People's March and right before Kennedy was assassinated. And my office looked right out on the reflecting pool in naval reactors, the old main Navy building, okay? And that went on, and that year, 1963 it was now, we were assigned to go to an atomic school for nuclear engineering, basically, at Westinghouse. It was called Bettis Atomic Power School. It was run by Bettis, and so I went there, had 700 class hours of nuclear engineering, basically, provided from shielding and thermal hydraulics and core design and everything you need to know for nuclear engineering in 6 months. 700 hours of anything in 6 months is a lot of work. Came back, passed that course, that system. Could have probably gotten a master's degree from Catholic University, but I didn't bother. Okay, I didn't go through that. So I went on and worked in naval reactors through 1980 in reactor design, and was in charge of the structural design basis, which then became the structural design basis for all nuclear plants, ASME structural design basis for nuclear plants, and a shock and vibration design basis, and a core design basis, and a welding entity, and so forth. So I had a lot of background and in design of cores and advanced core designs for the Navy. Mm-hmm. And also, it was a broad spectrum. You learned how to contract, you learned how to do specs, you learned how to do design work, you learned how to approve and get into thermal hydraulics. I taught thermal hydraulics to the prospective engineering officers, as it turned out, about the third year in. One of them turned out to be Admiral Watkins, who became a secretary of the DOE when I was out at Hanford, as a matter of fact. Okay, and anyway, so that was my first 18 years of technical work in naval reactors. Along that time frame, I had gotten to know lots of people at naval reactors, and they were spreading out all over the place in the nuclear business, including some had left and gone to NRC, one of which was assigned to the high-level waste division of NRC.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I had lived with him, and he was the best man at my wedding and so forth, and I knew him very well, Jack Martin. And he subsequently became the head of the Region 5 NRC office in Walnut Creek, California, and so forth, and he's retired now. But nevertheless, one day I get a call, and this is just background, because there's a community of people that know each other in the nuclear business, okay? One day I get a call from Martin asking me if anybody would like to, that I knew of at NR, that would like to come over to be his deputy in this group. And I gave him a couple names, one of which I was pretty sure wanted to leave NR. He had been there since the 50s. He gives him a call, and he goes over to NRC as his deputy. And then about a year later, This is 1979, I would say. About a year later, I get a call from the deputy. Robert Browning was his name, and you'll see his name on a lot of the letters that I sent back, because saying that, hey, would you like to come work as a materials section leader at NRC with a promotion. Okay, I was already a 14. I had been in the Navy for 4 years, went out of the Navy, became a civilian with the same job, increased pay about 3 times. Okay. And so I kept in that job and became a 14, and then they gave me a 15 as a section leader over, which was a pretty high. I mean, there only one more non-executive brand entity is a 16, and I was right up at the top end of 15s too. You know, you have a whole bunch of different stairwells, so that was a nice promotion. And so I went over to NRC as a section head for materials, and the materials were materials for waste package design and waste design, which was my forte, really. I mean, I had a lot of metallurgy under my belt already, and mechanical structural analysis and so forth. So I got into the materials section, and that was about the time that NRC was starting to look for a look at the repository issues, because the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which Martin, the fellow that went over there, was instrumental with Udall in putting together, along with Russell Jim and some of the Indian folks out here at Hanford, was instrumental in putting together. Martin almost wrote the section relative to licensing, okay, in that.
So they were looking for sites nationwide,
yeah, well,
to store
they wanted at
fuel
least
rods.
3 sites, because they had to do, NRC had to do an environmental impact statement, and you have to have alternatives. You can't just pick one and not look at alternatives. So the idea was there had to be 3 alternatives for high-level waste. And so 3 sites were being picked, and the Department of Energy had agreed, and and that was the law, okay, basically, as what had to be done to go through and do a licensing endeavor. And so so that occurred, and the key was that the licensing was for high-level radioactive waste, which is a very precise definition. It has to do with the source of the waste, and that's a key understanding that a lot of people don't have. But it has to do with the source of the waste, which is from reactors that operate and produce fission products, basically. Okay, so the fuel is a source-based definition, and you couldn't dilute it. There was no, the definition was set up so you could not dilute the waste by water and put it in the ocean and meet some low-level criteria. It was, and one of the biggest issues was iodine 129. There was lots of iodine 129 produced in this waste. Many curies, hundreds of curies probably. There's 50 curies right at Hanford by itself, okay. Of course, it's got a 16 million year half-life, but it also has the lowest per curie allowance in drinking water. Okay.
Just to back up a minute, the Hanford was selected as a possible site for basalt. It was called the Basalt Waste Isolation Project.
Yeah, there were 3 different rock types. There was a salt rock type, a basalt rock type, and a tuff rock type. Tuff is volcanic ash, basically, that's solidified. That's the Nevada test site on the Nevada tests. Others were looked at, for granite was looked at 2 originally, but it was narrowed down to 3 different rock types. Salt was considered a rock type. I mean, you might say salt isn't a rock, but it is a rock type. In fact, it's not a bad, depending on how deep it is, it's not a bad repository, as it turns out.
So in what year were you assigned to go to
I was
Hanford?
assigned then to Hanford in '83. I rode back and forth in the car because Browning lived right next to me in Arlington, and I rode back and forth. And one morning we're riding out to work in the district, and lo and behold, he says, "Now we're looking for site representatives. Would you be interested?" And I knew the first one, and he said the first one would be at Hanford. And I said, "Sure."
Okay, and this was supposed to be, a
I
different...
said, "Sure," right in a 5-second. I already knew that they were looking, that NRC was looking for reps, and I already decided that if I get asked, which I thought I might, yeah, I'd accept. So I accepted right there on that trial, and I already talked to Sonny about it too, and so.
Your wife.
Yeah, and we had already talked about trying to get out of the DC area. The traffic is just unbearable, Scale of 1 to 10, you're at a 1 here and a 9.5 there. Okay, it's terrible.
Well, Hanford, of course, had been a major Cold War site, the source of plutonium manufacturing during the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. That was a very secretive place. Now, the Basalt Waste Isolation Project wasn't supposed to be as secretive. You were supposed to be there to oversee what was going on. But what was your reaction when you got there? What was the reaction to... the Hanford reaction to your being assigned to go there?
You know how a dog looks at a cat or a cat looks at a dog? That was my reaction. I was either one or the other. I'm not sure which. I think I might have been the dog chasing the cat, but the cat didn't like it at all. Okay. So that was kind of the reaction. The DOE didn't want to have any presence of the NRC on the site, clearly. And so when I was assigned to the site in '83, September, I went out there. I had done a previous survey of housing and whatnot, you see, before then. My wife and I went out to look at Hanford. And we got assigned to what she terms as a broom closet. You can see it in here. It was just a one-room closet, basically, a little bigger than a closet, maybe. Enough room for a desk or so, in the basement of the building in Richland.
The federal building.
Federal building. Right next to me was the GAO office, which was a little bit bigger, but basically a bigger room closet. So here the GAO, which they didn't want either there, you see, and the NRC are sitting next to that. What a dreadful decision to put us side by side for DOE. Okay, it was a bad.
Because the GAO was the
we were
oversight.
on the same side.
Right.
We were doing the same thing,
for Congress,
basically.
yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So there was a lot of collaboration between GAO and NRC in that regard.
Right.
Right there, because we visited.
Why didn't they want you there?
Because they had that's, I'm guessing now, because I've never asked them why they didn't want me there. In fact, they always would claim they wanted me there. Okay. So it's a hypothetical question. They didn't want me there because of the uncovery of things they had covered up. They were dreadfully concerned, particularly the defense people, about what would happen vis-a-vis interaction with defense people on the site, okay? And because a lot of the site was contaminated with defense wastes, it was going to be inevitable that there would be an interaction, okay, at some point. The sooner the better, from my standpoint, because the information was pertinent to licensing the site, the Basalt site, okay? Well, just to give you some examples, they didn't want it to be widespread that the high-level waste had been dumped in the BC cribs, just outside the 200 area, by the way, okay? 3 cribs with nothing but high-level waste dumped in them because they didn't have tanks in the early 50s to do the disposal or the storage. They even injected deep injections into wells of high-level waste, okay? Not into one well, at least that I know of. They didn't want that to be known that they had already disposed of high-level waste in the aquifer, okay? In the deep aquifer. So that was never really come out. They certainly didn't want me getting familiar with the geology, for example, that was involved in the isolation requirements that NRC had, which was a 1,000-year groundwater travel time between the edge of the repository and the hospital environment. And any aquifer that could be tapped for water source was a hospital environment, including the ones higher up particularly, okay? And so they didn't want that. They didn't want that data, which was in the logs and all the data that had been accumulated on the site in the early days, in which they had never envisioned that they're going to have some NRC guy and GAO guy out there looking at whether or not the environmental issues are really being met or not. Okay.
So in 1980, you'd been there for a couple of years, and in 1985 you come across this letter. It was a 1973 letter from the president of Atlantic Richfield Hanford Company, that was the site manager at the time, to the Atomic Energy Commission. And they noted the strong possibility that long-lived radioactive Iodine-129 from Hanford was moving across the Columbia River to farm whales east of the nuclear reservation. And the head of Atlantic Richfield at the time said that information, quote, should be limited to those individuals that have a need to know. In other words, only kept close and not shared with, say, the farmers who might have been drinking or using the water or other members of the public. What did that letter say to you?
Well, just that. Except it also had a lot of intimidation in it for employees not to comply with the nuclear waste policy, with the objectives of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which were to understand the groundwater system at Hanford. Okay. It also was inconsistent with NEPA, which said you shouldn't classify or otherwise control environmental data. It's necessary for the public to know. So NEPA, the whole process was supposed to be an open process, you see. And they were doing their best in keeping the iodine data out of the out from coming into the open, and had done it for some time now, all the way after. It was interesting that that letter came out after NEPA was passed in '72, okay, and which clearly identified the energy. Now, separately, they had a project in the Gable Mountain that was to bury waste in Gable Mountain in canisters as vitrified waste, the defense waste that they had at Hanford, okay. They were trying to do something with their defense wastes and had a plan to put it in Gable Mountain. The Indians didn't like that at all, okay, because Gable Mountain has some sacred significance to the Indians, and plus it didn't meet the requirements NRC had for geologic isolation. It was not a geologic isolation, it was just out of sight, out of mind situation, okay. So that had been on the books up until the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, and then that sort of put the kibosh on any further action on that site in Gable Mountain, and so that project was turned into the BWIP project, which then all of a sudden became a deep geologic isolation site, because Rockwell International was there at that stage running that, and DOE didn't want to give that up. And of course the state was happy to maintain a big project like that in the state.
Now, I think the bottom line on this for you was that this data went back to the early 60s, but the data was not being used in the BWIP environmental assessment. Is that correct?
Well, it wasn't being used in any of this. It hadn't been identified to NRC heretofore, even though they knew from the 80s now. So this is 4 years into the project and communication. They knew into the 80s that that was very pertinent data, okay? And had just kept it secret, basically, under wraps, official use only, basically, like that letter says. You see, that meant, and I brought another letter, which was earlier, 82, which parlayed that same story to anybody that would talk to NRC, before I was out there, by the way, and before we had any agreement with DOE and the contractor, not to talk to anybody for fear of being, for threat of being terminated. So there was a big threat to the employees, hey, you don't let any of this information out. And when I came across, I learned of the idea of iodine and all tracers early on when I was still at NRC, that was a desirable natural tracer for radionuclides because it goes right with the water, you see, and so it's very pertinent to understanding groundwater travel time. Anyway, I was already up to speed of that, and there was this hydrology session over in Seattle, and I can't remember who it was that sponsored it. It might have been the state, but there were people from BWIP over there making presentations, and so I would always go to these things to find out what people were saying. Well, there was one fellow there, Vern Johnson, that was involved heavily in the BWIP hydrology, and he rode home with me in the government car from Seattle back, and that was a 4-hour trip. Okay, and I had lots of questions, and he was an honest broker. He had done studies about how the contamination early on had contaminated the Oregon coast. So he had done studies at Oregon or somewhere else in school. So he was into the issue of the contamination and what was going on and how hydrology was important. So I asked him, what about natural tracers that you get from radionuclides at Hanford? He says, oh yeah, there's been studies, but they really haven't come to light. Okay. Out of the BC cribs, for example, there's a plume of radioisotopes that come out of those BC cribs. And they were using that to try to understand how long it took in the unconfined system now, not in the confined system. They didn't want to even run tests in the confined system because it would indicate there might be stuff in the confined system, which would have queried the whole idea of the BWIP program because there was communication vertically up to the surface. So nobody wanted to show anything like that, you see. And there was a big effort to cover up the data which would indicate, particularly the fracture data. There's a huge tectonic force that is in that basalts, okay? And that force causes fractures at a 45-degree angle to the force. And the whole area in the BWIP site was fractured by these small fractures due to the rocks giving way and causing a breakage, okay? A pathway, a water pathway. And some of them were bigger than others. But the whole area was riddled, right where they wanted to put the repository, was riddled with these vertical fractures way down. Okay.
So what you were discovering had a potential to
I
stop
knew
the
that
whole
was the
mission.
case.
Is that correct?
Yes. So I mean, I knew exactly the information that I needed to collect to show that this system wouldn't work. Okay. The issue was getting the data, which I felt was available, including the iodine data. Okay.
Now, some of it was in a classified section of the Battelle library. even
Well,
though it wasn't classified. Is that
I
correct?
started talking, after I talked to Vern Johnson coming back, I started working on this in January, I think it was, of 1985. I probably talked up until the middle of February or the end of January to probably 30 different people, just asking them the question, hey, what about iodine 129 monitoring, and why isn't there data in the plumes for this plume and that plume on iodine 129? Some of them said, oh, there is. They didn't have any reports, so. Then I went into another endeavor per the request of my boss, Bob Browning. He was the section, the division boss. After Martin left, he became the division boss. So I'm working directly for the high level, for the waste management group. So the idea was that I would send these reports, and he asked me to do something else, and I'd have to go look at my notes here what it was, but it wasn't to do with iodine, okay, in the February time frame. So I stopped working on iodine for about a month, okay, and was working on something else. And I can tell you what it was. It's just that I don't remember exactly what it was. And then started back up about March. And I talked to probably another 30 or 40 people. I estimated in the report that I wrote in May that I had spoken to 50 to 75 people. Well, it was closer to 75, I think. And lo and behold, asking about data, out comes the iodine report. And I said, well, let me borrow that for a day or so. So I borrowed it for a day or so, made a copy of it, okay, and gave it back to this person. And never interacted with that person again, because I was sensitive to how persecution may go, okay, and retaliation might go. And so I was very careful. In fact, I've never revealed who that source was yet. And I told folks at NRC and also at Rockwell, well, if you get a judge and a court order for me to disclose that information, I will in camera, but I'm not going to do it to you, okay? So there I was, sitting on this information. I thought about it for a while and how I wanted to confirm it and get some collaboration. So I went out to the library to see if this document was in the library files. Well, it wasn't.
At Battelle?
Yeah, at Battelle, the Battelle 300 library. All the technical information should be.
And it wasn't there.
No, it wasn't there, but there were 75 other files, other documents on iodine 129. I just looked in the card catalog, and there were about 75 documents. I got them all listed in this one report. Okay, I made a list of them. And you'll see, this was the document. I left my notes over there, and I got panicky. This was the document with all that information, and you can see what I wrote down at the time. I thought I'd lost it. And finally, I retracked where this must be, and the woman over there in the librarian had my notes, okay? And so I went immediately out. But I had a Q clearance to go into the lab. I could see any of their files, basically, except some that might have been a separate classification. Well, some of these 75 documents were classified secret.
In the mid-'80s.
Well, no,
Still in the mid-80s.
yeah, still in the mid-80s. They didn't bother declassifying stuff that had been classified secret in the 60s or 50s that was still in that file. So I thought, the title and the policy in all of the government was never to make a file that was classified that you couldn't find the document. So the title had to be unclassified, but it identified the classification of the document and the number and so forth, okay? And all secret documents I knew had been categorized, you know, with a index, because you got a number. They're all numbered, okay? And so the indexes of the classified files are supposed to be unclassified. And I've been talking to, in fact, I talked to the folks who were doing the downwinder business 25, 30 years ago, that what you want to do is get the files of those classified documents so you can know what to ask for. Okay.
Now, when you were
So-
looking for this stuff, then and raising questions about it, then the Energy Department stepped in, and they started it. Isn't that correct? They started an investigation of whether there'd really.
Well,
been
that
a
was
cover-up.
later on, I went to a meeting in DOE of the general manager wasn't there, manager of DOE wasn't there, but all the second layer managers were there, including a fellow named Sandiford and another guy, both of which were working in the defense area. Okay? They didn't like me at all, I'll tell you. And there were a bunch of people from Rockwell. There were probably 30 or 40 people. And Sandiford just made note of the fact that they never had gotten any. I was asking the question. They never had, the Department of Energy, nor the IRTA, nor the AEC had ever collected any iodine data, which I knew was false. Okay, so that's just lying to the NRC, basically. And at that stage, this is another interesting little sublight, but at that stage, I thought it was a felony, because I thought that Part 21 of the NRC rules applied, which says when you're doing design work for a nuclear facility, which is very well defined, you can't lie to people. You can't lie to the NRC in particular, okay? It's a felony. That's obfuscation of the data and corruption of the data, which is important to health, safety, and the environment. Well, here's this guy lying. So what am I? The first thing I do is I call my boss back, and I've got a case of DOE lying to me, just frankly out and right. And I think I need to report this to the Inspector General, which I did. The Inspector General came out and interviewed me, and I had known him, but I had never been interviewed, and I just kind of like this, except they had tape recorders. I had my own tape recorder too, okay? I had all the documents. This went on for about 45 minutes, I would say. And I told him exactly, hey, here's the documents, here's the question. You know, Sandiford was lying to me. And so that was the allegation. So they then started to do an investigation. And the investigation was under that pretense was that I couldn't have access to people anymore. You know, so they decided, since the investigation was going on, NRC all of a sudden was limited by the investigation, even though I had the MOU that didn't say anything about investigations, you know, being a stopper in doing the whole project. Okay.
But that slowed you down then, because you couldn't talk to anybody during that investigation.
It was harder to talk. It's not that
Yeah.
I didn't talk to people. I still managed to talk to people. I did a lot more reviewing of documents and writing down what I knew to be the case you know, and you'll see some of that in the documents. But that was an impediment to the whole investigation to get data out. See, the NRC's issue, the whole modus operandi, was born out of the 3 Mile Island incident, where the NRC learned that you had to be completely open with the public or else NRC would be discredited. Okay? So my job was to be completely open with the public. Anybody from the public could come in and go through my safes and see everything I had in the safe drawer except one item, and that was my secretary's personal file, okay, which was personal information. I didn't care if they saw my own file. I showed them my own file. Okay, nobody ever did that, but that was an open invitation. You know, I never did get accused of being closed, never, by anybody. In fact, it was the opposite. I had the NRC new commissioner under Reagan, Admiral Carr, come out and say, "How come you're putting all this information out?" I said, "Well, that's the policy of NRC to do that."
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that.
He didn't know what the policy was.
At that time, though, the NRC was changing.
Oh,
it was
yeah.
the Reagan administration.
Reagan-
And so what kind of pressure did that put on you?
Well,
when the
eventually it
NRC
changed completely. Once Reagan got all 5 commissioners, they're the ones that decide the policies for the NRC. And that changed in about 1987, near the end. I mean, I didn't worry about it because I knew the project was going to be canceled anyway. About July of 1987, I had been having contact with Dingle and Wyden and Glenn and a number of other folks, including congressional oversight. They were all getting, by that time, getting my, per request, getting my letters that I was sending back to headquarters and went into the public document room. So they were, I mean, I had 2 or 3 governors on the list, you know, and EPA. You might have even been on the list. I think you were. I know Heal was, for example. And anybody that wanted to get a copy, I made a copy. And I think I had a distribution list of about 35 people, different people that got the whole report. And some of the reports were quite significant. They had, like, one of them, the one that you identified in one of these questions, I think it's the October 1st, 1986 report, not 85, but 86 report, has something like S attachments to it, okay? And it's a big, thick package like this, which was all the, remember I said I started to get into analyzing stuff much more than just talking to people, so now I'm getting reports and writing letters on the reports, okay, you see? And that's the reason I had all these attachments to identify the issues in writing, basically.
You said you knew in July of '87 that Hanford was going to be
well, I didn't know.
Around there.
I didn't know because Congress hadn't really
Right.
defunded it.
Right, but in December of '87 it was officially dropped.
Yes.
As a site.
Yes, it was officially dropped, and I got notice in early January that my job was abolished because there was no more project there at NRC, and I had an option of going back into the waste management group at NRC or retiring.
And in the
So I retired.
in the interim, the Energy Department, which had started that was a cover-up probe,
Yeah.
concluded there was not a cover-up, but then 6 months later, in early '88, the General Accounting Office of Congress said exactly the opposite.
Right, and
they
that-
said there had been a cover-up, and that had it not been for your work,
I never
it
did
wouldn't
see
have
that.
been
You know,
uncovered.
I read that in your in here, but I never did see the
I have it.
GAO report. I have to look at that
Yeah.
because there was a similar report later on. You know, after NRC, I went to work for the Indians, and one of the issues it was a much broader scope of purview at that stage, and one of the issues I got approval from Russell or no, this was in between that time frame. I got approval. I didn't need approval. I was working for Heal at that stage with a contract of Greenpeace to put together an item on issue at Hanford, which I did it for the Red Path presentation, which identified another cover-up. Okay, that cover-up was explosion hazard in the tanks. The cesium ferrocyanide explosion hazard in the tanks, to be specific.
That was another risk, another Hanford risk.
Yeah. And that then was, that whole explosion hazard was reviewed by a fellow named Steve Blush, who was environmental assistant secretary under Hazel O'Leary now. Okay, so this is in the 90s. Steve Blush reviewed that whole area, and he also had cognizance of QA at Hanford. He wrote a big, thick Blush report, and he had the same words in there. That's the ones I remember about, if it hadn't been for me, the explosion hazard would never have come to sight. Okay. And he called me a former NRC representative. Right. So it was the same words the GAO used, except I was a former representative.
At that time.
And I never did see that GAO report for whatever reason. I have a bunch of them, but
yeah.
I just that went above me somehow. I would have remembered that.
It said there was a pervasive cover-up.
Oh, yeah.
You were responsible. But let's just go back to the
cover-up of the cover-up.
Let's go back. Yeah, there you go. Cover-up of the cover-up. What did you learn from this about ethical decision-making in government? I know you gave a talk, and sometime in '88, I think, at the University of Washington about this, and you said you gave the NRC a D or an F, and a D for protecting the health and safety of citizens from nuclear waste hazards, and an F for environmental protection.
Yeah, well,
do you still hold to those low grades?
Yeah. NRCs basically absolved themselves of the environmental issue, and has it now relegated to EPA. And that's an interesting thing as an aside. There was a general thought in DOE, and I think in Congress too, probably, that the basis for hazardous wastes, heavy metals, which are disposed of too in the ground, should be no different than it is for nuclear waste, because they both cause health effects. Okay. So why do you use a different system? Well, it turns out the hazardous wastes were being based on a risk assessment. And risk assessment, from my standpoint, are notoriously corrupt, okay? Because the assumptions are arbitrary, and there's really no control per that whole procedure on getting good assumptions in the risk assessment. Independent good assumptions in the risk assessment. So that you got factors that you can crank in and da-da-da-da. And this is, John Till did this extensively for getting the analysis for the downwinders.
The header report.
Header report, right. But nevertheless, the risk assessment, all risk assessment are phony, as best as I can tell. The best example is the risk assessment that was patterned after you here in the United States of the one done for Fukushima. It didn't include a simultaneous tsunami and earthquake, by assumption. Oh, that's impossible, okay? Now, so that never was evaluated in that risk, in that so-called risk assessment. We all know what happened. That whole idea is become very, very common, and the reason it's become common is it's easy to bluff it, you know, easy to fake it, so to speak, and consequently, the public doesn't understand what's happening in these assumptions. They're pretty complex assumptions that sometimes you got to have an expert that really understands how the assumption can affect the outcome and whether it's reasonable or not, based on experience. And a lot of times, you really can't tell. You don't know. So there you're up in the air. You don't have a design that allows that, basically. Since you can't analyze it safely, you don't do it. Now, one of the things I did is in this batch of documents is put in some stuff of my comments. Remember I said in 1986 I started to make comments because I was curtailed in talking to people and getting the data out myself. I started making comments. Well, one of the comments is on this very design procedure. Rickover taught us that the devil is in the details. The devil of the design is in the details. And people understood that in DOE, except they used that devil to obfuscate the details, okay? You know, to make it look like there was something that was covered up, okay? And it never was. So that whole issue of design and the NEPA, how it evolved away from the NRC model for handling nuclear isotopes, which you had a model and you had to decide whether there was reasonable assurance. Reasonable assurance is a high level of assurance that this is a conservative issue. If there's a 10% chance that the assumption is wrong, that's not reasonable assurance, okay?
Let's go back to iodine for just a minute. You were there in '86 when the Energy Department, after lots of pressure from the media and interest groups and Freedom of Information Act requests, released the big initial stacks of documents on the Hanford releases, which sort of stunned the region because they turned out to be pretty massive. But a lot of the coverage, at least the press coverage, focused on the iodine-131, the shorter-lived iodine. But you were looking at the same time on this very long-lived iodine-129. And I'm wondering, do you think that iodine-129 as a health hazard got enough attention?
Well, I'll tell you, if you look at the drinking water standard, it's at 4 picocures per liter, which is the lowest of any radioisotope for drinking water. Per that, and that's been around for a long time in the ICRP, and so I would say, yeah, iodine-129 is a long-term hazard. Once you get it into your thyroid, it doesn't get out very easily. So you can accumulate iodine-129 over a long time. Iodine-131 has an 8-day half-life or something like that, and it's gone pretty quick. So you get a big dose, but you don't have an aggravating long-term dose, which I don't know. I know, for example, that cancers are caused by double-strand breaks in DNA, and the iodine, if it's near a DNA molecule, will cause a double-strand break, just like tritium does. Okay, tritium is has a electron that's ejected during the decay, which is fairly short range. For example, the tritium electron is about, the distance it goes is about the same distance as a nucleus in a cell. It's microns, okay? All the energy is deposited in the nucleus, and if you get a beta that goes through a nucleus, it's going to cause a double-strand break. If that doesn't kill the cell and it reproduces, you got a double-strand break, which can be a cancer-forming break, okay? So the long-term insult on over long term may be worse than it is in a short term associated with x-rays or something else like that, where your body has a chance, particularly for old folks, okay? You know, my thyroid, if it has 129, it's still there from when I got it originally. Well, your immune system goes to pot as you get older, and you don't correct those double-strand breaks as readily. That's one of the things I learned in molecular biology, by the way, in the 60s. And so I've been always very sensitive. One of the things I was worried about was that the ICRP rules don't look at mutagenic effects. That's where the gene cells are affected. They don't look, you know why they don't look at mutagenic effects as being controlling issues on what should be in because they assume that statistically a mutagenic effect will not occur in a population where it affects more than one person in a million. That doesn't apply to an Indian population where you only have 10,000 people in the Indian population, so you can get mutagenic effects which are propagated through that whole population fairly readily. We did when I worked for the Indian. The reason I'm saying this is because this is another cover-up. The assumption that you don't have populations that are small populations that are affected by mutagenic isotopes is just wrong. That's a bum assumption on the criteria.
So let's back up for just a second then. And right after, then BWIP got canceled, your job was terminated, and then you went to work as a consultant for the Yakama Indian
Well,
Nation.
not until
Is that
'91.
Till
Russell,
91.
he hadn't got. Russell was working on it. I mean, he was
Russell
working
Jim.
on Russell Jim.
Explain who he is.
Russell Jim was a Yakama Indian who was involved with the nuclear waste business right in the 70s, late 70s, and worked with Martin and Udall to get, remember I said, to get the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to reflect Indian concerns, okay? And so the words in that Nuclear Waste Policy Act basically came out of Russell's interaction with Udall, okay? He had been involved with the originally. His father was the chairman in the '60s or in the '50s. His brother Robert Jim was the chairman during Nixon, and he had, I don't know, there were 7 kids in that family. I've known all the living ones, and the children of the ones passed away, Robert and Ralph Jim, quite well. Okay, I know them quite well, and anyway, and Russell's brother helped me put a cabin together up in Alaska for a year, basically in the summertime. So I knew him very well. So I knew this family. Russell was a very, very strong advocate of the Indian indigenous rights and culture. In fact, I didn't know this until a week ago, or a couple weeks ago, that he had been invited to talk at UNESCO in the late '60s. And he talked not only on environmental stewardship, but on cultural rights of indigenous folks all over the world. So he was a world advocate of cultural indigenous rights. Okay, he was involved with Hanford early on, because he was involved with the nuclear business, and Hanford was part of the Yakama ceded land, and he was assigned that task by the group, what was it, I think it's, what's it called in the Yakama Nation? It's environmental culture or something. It's not waste management, but that waste management group, environmental waste management, was under the heading, and the heading was basically environmental group in the Yakama Nation. So he was involved in the BWIP business from the get-go, even when they were trying to put Gable Mountain as a repository. That caused an uproar within the Yakama Nation, basically, because that was a sacred mountain, and they had been visiting that all along. You know, it's interesting. The DOE and the AEC allowed the Indians to go on the land to do because that was a treaty right, okay?
And they're still involved.
They're still involved. The treaty rights are like treaty. I mean, the treaty is a treaty. It's like constitutional right, basically.
And the tribe has standing as a tribe
Exactly.
to intervene.
See, they never were defeated like a lot of the other tribes in the United States militarily. So they worked out a treaty agreement. And the Treaty of 1855 was just that. Okay, so it's anyway. That's how he got involved. He then was working and funded by the DOE for the BWIP program leadership. Then when that closed, that funding under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act went away. But there was still this issue of cooperation and coordination on the site, and he managed to get Hazel Leary, who was appointed, to set up a program under cooperation with the Indians through the DOE for oversight of Hanford, basically. When that happened, he called me the next day. Russell did, because he was assigned, and he had been doing all this back in DOE. In the after the demise of the BWIP program, he had been working with the DOE to establish this program, and he got it established. And the first call he makes, can you put together an office and run that office as a technical analyst in Richland, which I didn't know was coming up. I knew there was work, happening to try to get something approved, but I didn't know it would happen. Okay. And I said, sure. So then I proceeded to establish an office in Richland, we had about 7 or 8 employees there that I hired, and to do oversight of Richland. So that occurred in probably April of '91, and finally in '97 I retired again. And I wanted to put a house together in Alaska anyway, okay? And so I retired in '97, bought property in Alaska in '98, built a house up there. I'm an Alaskan resident now.
What can you summarize what the tribe was able to accomplish from '91 to '97, or the years you were there, in terms of Hanford oversight?
They had a very, in '80s during the BWIP program, they had a very effective lawyer, Jimmy Hovis. His daughter is still part of the Hovis program out of Yakama. In fact, I just talked to her 2 weeks ago. And they're basically have gotten to the position under the EPA Superfund cleanup to have lots of liabilities identified and lots of cleanup emphasis through the Superfund issues to get the site cleaned up. Now, DOE hasn't really changed very much in their initiative, if you will, to clean up the site. And the state is worse, because the state loves to have this very expensive high-level waste vitrification plant going on and on and on and on and on.
It gets more and more expensive.
Gets more and more expensive. It promises to be a cash cow, a golden goose laying golden eggs for the state forever, basically. I mean, for the foreseeable future, unless Congress decides to cut it, okay? Which I think is coming up, because the design of that plant isn't going to work. Okay. And I said that right from the get-go. I could not understand how DOE could ever agree, nor the state agree, with the design of a plant which you couldn't repair. You had to go good for 40 years, you know, design of that. So you couldn't get in and repair it like you could of the modular construction of the Purex plant. You could change out components if they failed, okay? But here, this plant, it's a black hole, and it's supposed to work for 40 years. Never heard of that. I mean, I know in the Naval Reactors program, we had reactors that might have worked for 40 years, but they were well designed and simple. And nevertheless, they could be repaired at any stage, okay? They might have gone for 40 years. We wouldn't allow them because we didn't depend on the capability, okay? We always had overhauls established midway or less than midway through the life of the ship, which was 50 years. But to put a huge plant like that and say it's got to operate for 40 years without any repair is just nonsense. It's not going to happen. The state should know that. I wrote plenty of letters for the Yakama saying this is not an acceptable design, just because it's very unlikely it's going to work. Okay, I've never seen anything like that. And it's been going on. You know, they were supposed to start taking waste out in '98. Here it's 21 years later, and still no waste is. And they're talking now 2036. It's on and on and on. And DOE is wonderful at doing that kind of project anymore. Okay, where there's really no incentive to get it done. Okay. In fact, they may have a disincentive because their jobs are maintained, particularly the jobs of the corporations that are making money off of this black hole. Okay, and believe me, that's a big money sink, and nothing being accomplished but hiring people and keeping the finances of Richland sailing high, and the state as well.
So in 1986, when all those records were declassified by the Department of Energy, I don't recall any information coming out on any of the other radioisotopes of iodine other than I-131, because I know there are more, not just I-129 and I-131. Why, do you know?
Well, there was a whole disclosure earlier on the Iodine 129 issue. In fact, I remember getting 4 boxes. Those were some of the boxes that I know the Yakamas have that I didn't keep. They really weren't pertinent because they didn't have the data in them, and they didn't have the reports from Parker in the early days, which were classified and should be declassified. So Parker would write classified environmental and safety reports. I think his first name was Herb Parker.
Yeah.
Back to the AEC, all throughout the Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
And those reports would have been the basis, for example, for buying up the Waluki slope.
Yeah.
And DOE and the AEC deciding to do that in the 50s, as Karen and I have discussed. So those reports, all those Herb Parker reports should be declassified and made available. And they were monthly reports. They were probably secret, is what I would guess. A lot of them probably were secret. So remember I said the file books with the secret documents listed from that time? That would be the first thing I'd ask for to get out of archives. It's very specific. That should be around, okay? That should be available. And so get that document, and then you got a whole bunch of documents that are BNL, or I've forgotten what the designation was on it. It may have been it may have been GE or some sort of report. Whoever Herb Parker was working for, I know he worked for the laboratory at one time, but
I think it was GE.
I think it was GE though too. Those reports would be very key to looking at the data that was reported back then and what the conclusions were about it. They clearly had an idea. I mean, once the silver reactors were put on the stacks, which was to remove the iodine from the stack, at T plant, at Purex, and at U plant, where the dissolution was going on. Once those iodine reactors, which are nothing but a silver iodide, I mean a silver nitrate ring, which then chemically reacts with the iodine to form silver iodide. And so all the gases go up through these rings, and they might have some water or something pouring over them too to make it more soluble and get it. But the rings collect the iodine and did a very good job at doing that. So they probably reduced the iodine concentration by 10,000 maybe, which was significant. You know, 10,000 from what it was before, by a factor of 10,000. I know, I'm pretty sure, I don't know this for sure, but I'm just putting it together because I've never seen the secret documents, a secret document. I made a point that I didn't want to see any secret documents. In fact, I didn't want to see any classified documents either. At least take them home with me, okay? Take them back. And I never did. I just had unclassified stuff. Even though I had access, I could have reviewed the classified documents in the library, for example. But the ones you want to look at are the early ones, because that's when the iodine was coming out. The green run wasn't done to look at contamination of people. They knew about that pretty well already. The green run was to validate a model for how iodine distributed in the atmosphere. So then they could fly U-2s over Russia and decide where their plants were just by sampling the air streams at 100,000 feet. And that worked, I think.
So
that's the reason why they claimed that data was classified.
Yeah.
Because the analysis, which was baloney, the analysis was written up in other documents on how you did it. You know, you had to put it in a reactor over Pullman, or I think it was Pullman, over the University of Washington. Maybe it was Idaho, Moscow, I'm not sure. To activate the iodine 129, so then it became quite a bit more activated than it was just as iodine 129, and you got a signal that you could monitor. Otherwise, you know, there's monitoring attocuries, very sensitive, very, very sensitive monitoring scheme. Attocuries 10 to minus 18, I think, curies per liter. That's a pretty sensitive monitoring scheme. And the way they did that, they increased the activity from 10 to the minus 18 curies per liter to about 10 to the minus 12, or something that, you know, they raised it by about 1 million, the activity, by activating it to a different species in the reactor. And that was a very sensitive. Now that's what they claimed was classified. It wasn't classified, though.
So what I'm wondering is, you mentioned John Till and his work on TSP and his work on header. And did John Till request any of these documents on the other nuclides of iodine?
Well, I don't know if he did or not. I certainly recommended it to him 2 or 3 times, at least in public meetings down in Richland.
Right.
Because I said, hey, get Patel to give you the data on the early iodine releases and see if the See if your calculations are what they measure in the ditch water for the cows. They didn't use ditch water as a drinking water for cows. They assumed it came out of a well. That's nonsense. I had gone over and talked to the in between times. Okay, this is after I'm a nuclear rep and before I became a representative for the Indians. This is kind of the time frame that I was looking for issues for HEAL. I went over and asked the farmers, about 2 or 3 of them, how their cows that they had, their cattle and cows, drank in the wintertime. And they all said, oh, they drink probably 90% ditch water. We don't run well water for them. They drink everything that's runoff. Well, that's right surface water with the Iodine 131 that came right out of the stack, okay? So you, in snow or rain, whatever it might be. But nevertheless, it's at the surface and the cows are drinking. You think that got into their modeling? No, absolutely not. Even though there was data on what the milk probably had in it from early on. I mean, those guys were smart during the Manhattan Project. They were monitoring what they knew would be a problem, okay? And if they didn't monitor the milk, they're a lot more stupid than I thought they were, okay, at that stage.
Do you know when the milk pathway was first recognized? They were always telling us it was around 1957 after wind scale, but then you look into
that's all baloney.
It's way before that, 30s,
Absolutely.
20s.
That's why they never did want to release the Parker reports, because those Parker reports, more than likely, I fully believe it, okay, because I know how smart they were, and I know that the Waluki Slope was bought up in the 50s, I mean in the 40s, to avoid long-term liability, and that was per Ned Trapnell, who was the public relations person for the AEC during the Manhattan Project, okay? He came out and visited me. He was a personal friend. And he came out and visited me while I was still working for NRC, probably around this time, 84 maybe even. So I knew that there was an issue with Iodine 129 early on. And a lot of it came directly from his mouth that, whoa, if there wasn't any issue, why in the hell would they go out of their way to buy up all that land north of the river, okay?
Is there still I-129 in the water, in the aquifer over in the farms across from Hanford? Is there still I-129 present in the water or the wells?
I would think so. There's Iodine 129 in the river water at Hanford that's coming in. I mean, they monitor it as a beta emitter. They don't tell you it's iodine. That's another issue with EPA. EPA Clean Water Standard ought to have a requirement on Iodine 129, period. They don't, because it costs a little bit more to monitor it, okay? Yep. You know, it's a more complex monitoring or evaluation issue. Yeah. But the city water, they assume that, they should assume that all the beta decay is based on Iodine 129. They don't do that. They don't know what it's based on. It's clearly some of it's tritium, but tritium is just as insidious as Iodine 129. It permeates your whole body, not just the thyroid primarily. Yeah. So it gets into every DNA molecule in every nucleus, and lots of tritium. So when you get tritium in your body at the drinking water standard of 20 picocuries per liter, you've got a lot of tritium going off everywhere in your body. You know, and causing double-strand breaks.
Right. I want to know.
And some of them get repaired, some of them don't. Right. Those that don't, particularly in old guys like me, cause cancer. Right. Maybe even over 50.
Why is it that I-131 was kind of the radionuclide of focus, at Hanford, even though, do you know that, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but
Why
they
was-
always said, you know, they only concentrated on I-131 for the Hanford thyroid disease study. They only concentrated on the thyroid, and we asked about exposure to other radionuclides, like you've just been mentioning, which can be full body damage.
Tritium is a
cause-
very insidious mutagenic
Yeah.
isotope, I think.
Yeah.
In fact, we did a study when I was working for the Indians looking at the vole, VOLE population
I know about
around
those, yeah.
Chernobyl
Yeah.
after the Chernobyl accident. The vole population, which was drinking tritiated water, which was well monitored and measured, the vole population, if you wanted to avoid mutagenic effects that were noticeable in the voles, you had to limit it to not 20,000 picocuries per liter, but 200 picocuries per liter. That would eliminate the mutagenic effects in that vole population. Now, their double-strand breaks are just like ours, I think, okay? And they may even have a better mechanism for repair and double-strand breaks than people do. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong and it's the inverse of that. But they're very similar, and the mutagenic effects in the voles came out at 200, 100 times less than the ICRP specifies for drinking water for tritium. So tritium, from a mutagenic standpoint, particularly for Indians in the small breeding population, so to speak, is important.
Yeah.
I made that point probably a half a dozen times in the 200 some odd letters I wrote for the Indians from 91 to 97. Okay,
Yeah.
so that is a, and if you're interested, I think I don't have hard copies of all those letters, but I got a digital copy of all of them. I would want to get the current group's agreement to give that up, because they were Yakama Indian letters, which were sent to DOE, so they should be in a DOE file too, but they're probably very hard to come by. They're easy to come by for me because I got them all on digital stuff. So that's a source. It focused on different issues, and we mentioned some of these.
Yeah.
Much more cultural than environmental and okay, which are primarily cultural too, but like the fisheries. That I talked to Karen this morning. The fisheries for the Indians were very important, and the chrome, the trivalent chrome, which is chromic, basically chromate, okay, that went into the river, once through the reactors and then into the river in a diffuser that they put the cooling water in a big pipe that went out across the river so that everything was diffused over a large, it wasn't a, but downstream, well, anywhere that chromate, dichromate, got into a red's bed, okay, the fry coming out of the eggs were sensitive at 3 parts per billion chromate, and they couldn't survive. So it decimated the salmon population once the chromate started to be issued until it was discontinued. Okay, there was no basically salmon spawning going on in the Columbia River below where those diffusers were in the water.
Yeah. And so that was University of Washington studies on fisheries that picked some of this up? Maybe?
No.
No?
I don't know who did, it might have been University of Washington. I don't know whose study, I could find that out, but I don't remember who actually did the study on the fry and the sensitivity at 300 or 3 billion parts. Three 3 billionths of a part per.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Or 3 billion parts per liter, I guess it was, or something like that.
I'm learning so much from you here. I have
Not-
one final question regarding back to John Till and Header. You'd mentioned, we were talking a little bit about risk assessment
Yeah.
and John Till and sort of his way of applying risk assessment. And I wanted to understand how his approach to risk assessment might have impacted the results of Header. I don't know if this is
Well-
too broad a question.
One, he didn't have a validation scheme or whatever you want to call it to show that his assumptions were valid and the models were valid. In any analysis, if the analysis doesn't reflect what's real, you get a bum answer. Okay, so his validation schemes were not acceptable. And they weren't acceptable because they didn't use existing data. With a complex system like that, it's experimental, it's empirical how it's going to work, because the detailed modeling is just impossible to specify. You have to bring together a whole bunch of random variables, and that gives you a result. And it can vary depending on the weather by a significant amount too. You know, the weather has a big influence. So he did not take the data that had been collected and over different weather conditions and different times of the year and so forth early on. That's the reason why I'm talking about Parker. He didn't bother. You asked me if I knew whether he got that data. I don't know. He should have been asked that in a court of law. Did you ever get any data from the time frame when iodine was being emitted? And if so, where is it? And let him lie under the court in the court of law and go to jail for perjury. I don't think that question was asked. I know I suggested that he get the data, and I fully believe, like I'm telling you, that the data existed. It was secret, though.
Yeah.
It was secret, and that whole secrecy stemmed on into the 60s and into the 70s and up to the time it finally got identified.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. That's
That the
amazing.
cover-up had been that long. It was that long.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Anyway, and they used the guise of it being secret because of this, of the espionage issues, I think. I don't know that for sure, but that's the only thing I could conclude.
Yeah.
I mean, from my own rationale.
Yeah.
And when I caused a big consternation, remember I had 75 documents that I got out of the, 3 or 4 of those documents had to do with this laboratory that was analyzing the air samples, apparently. I didn't know that, well, for sure. And here I list these documents in my report. I think I listed 75, or I know I sent them back to NRC. But when I went to DOE to find out whether these titles, I went to Ellie at DOE, who was the classification officer there, to ask him to make sure that these titles were not classified. Well, that caused a consternation because there was an effort to take the ones that were secret that shouldn't have been in that file in the first place, you know, in the card catalog and in the technical library. And it turned out that Fred Brower and his crew that were doing the analysis didn't know any better, I think, and they didn't know that they weren't supposed to put information that came out of U-2 planes, and that's what I'm guessing. I don't know that, but I'm just saying they didn't know that they were supposed to keep this secret document out of the library.
Bob,
So-
I had a follow up on the, you were talking about Header and Till,
Yeah.
John Till, and that he didn't have good validation schemes. There was an interesting development in the middle of the Hanford trial when Judge McDonald still had it. There was an expert report that both the defense and the plaintiff's attorneys agreed to. It was written by Thomas Pigford, who was an engineer at UCal Berkeley at
Yeah.
the time, and McDonald sealed it for I can't remember, almost a decade. It finally came out.
Pigford was, as I remember, he was also in the National Science Academy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and he was a pretty honest broker. I mean, he felt that he wasn't going to do anything to impugn his reputation, and he didn't.
That report was leaked to me, and I wrote about it, and he said exactly what you were saying, that the Header dose estimates didn't take into account enough variables, and that they significantly underestimated
Yeah, well, that's right.
the doses.
They weren't validated. I significantly underestimated. It could have been by 3 or 4 orders of magnitude, not enough. Okay. Anyway, I know and the time frame is of interest, because the time frame was definitely limited by when the iodine reactors went on the stacks. Okay? And and that should be available. When did AEC and the contractor install those iodine reactors on T plant and U plant, which were there? The Purex wasn't operating yet. Okay, Purex had iodine reactors on it from the get-go, as best I know. But the T plant in particular was probably the oldest one that probably was emitting iodine.
Bob, I just had one follow-up question about the Hanford thyroid disease study. I don't know if you followed that at all, but it was announced with great fanfare, and they couldn't correlate thyroid cancers they found with doses, and the National Academy of Sciences stepped in and analyzed what they did, and they said, this was the Fred Hutchinson study, and they said that their power analysis failed, that the study didn't have enough statistical power to detect an effect. And yet it was used as a way of saying that downwinders should be reassured because they didn't come up with a result that correlated doses with illnesses.
Well, the ones that would have been very well correlated, I think, were the reception of the iodine 131 when it was coming out of the stacks without any reactors on the top. Okay,
Yeah.
so that time frame, if the data was being used for people that lived considerably after that time or weren't kids to begin with, then yeah, you might not have a very good correlation. The good correlation should come from that early days. So those would have been people that were born, that are my age now, basically. I was born in '39, so these are kids that were born from 43 to 46 or 47, whenever this was going on. So they're mid-70s right now. That's where the correlation should be identified, and where do you expect the cancer, latent cancers would be coming out in live people. You'd also want to look to see if people had died, if there's a registry, if people had died in that cohort, that age group, more frequently from the iodine, or from thyroid cancers than others, and that in itself should provide data on the actual concentration, the end of the dose reconstruction model. That should confirm whatever was at the end of the dose reconstruction model. I've never seen in the thyroid study a consistent cohort. Pickford understood how it should happen too, I think, and if I would I would put a lot of faith in what he had to say, okay? Particularly if they didn't want to give it to you. That's the screwy thing. What's the basis for not putting something out? If you hire somebody that's independent, I mean, it's a priori, we're hiding this. It's not consistent with what we want you to know.